you. Welcome to Risky Reels Radio. Okay, guys. Okay, that's enough. All right, welcome everyone. Today we're going to be diving deep into a conversation that's going to challenge us to think critically and see the world through a sharper lens. I'm your host, Anthony, and today we're exploring one of the most impactful and misunderstood topics in history, the theories of race and racism, constructing the hierarchy. Let's take a look at the board real quick. Did you know that race as we know it today is a relatively modern concept? It has no generic basis, yet it's been used to justify everything from slavery and colonialism to systematic inequalities that persist in our institutions today. Now, how did this happen? And why do these racial hierarchies continue to shape our world? Who knows? But to help us unpack this complex topic, we've got my interviewee, Leia.
Thanks for having me, Anthony. I've been looking forward to diving into this conversation with you.
Well, thank you, Leia, for coming on, and welcome to Risky Reels Radio. It's so great to have you on the show. Now, before we get into the history and impact of racial hierarchies, let's lay some groundwork. We've all heard the term race, but what does it actually mean? Race is the meaning and difference assigned to groups of people based on assumed biological distinctions such as skin color, ancestry, and physical features. But here's the truth, it's not all biological. Race is a social construct, something that is society's created, and is not something rooted in science. Leia, when you think about race as a social construct, what stands out to you the most?
For me, it's realizing how much of our history and society has been shaped by this idea, an idea that's not even based on biological fact. The fact that most genetic variation exists within racial groups, not between them, really drives home how artificial these categories are.
Absolutely, Leia. Very well spoken. And yet, despite being artificial, I think that the concepts of race have very real consequences. Racism. The belief in the inferiority of certain groups based off of these constructed differences has been used to justify inequality and discrimination for centuries. In today's episode, we're going to dig into how these racial hierarchies were constructed, the ways that they persisted in our institutions even today, and what we can do to change them. Now let's get started. Leia, can you share some thoughts on how these ideas of race and racial hierarchies first emerged? In order to understand where we are today, we first need to take a look back at the origins of race as a concept. Now, many of us assume that race has always just existed, but it's actually a relatively modern idea. Leia, let's kick things off by talking about how race as we know it came to be, and where did these ideas first originate?
Great question, Anthony. One key point is that race didn't exist as a structured concept until the 16th and 17th centuries during the Age of Exploration. As European powers began colonizing the Americas, Africa, and Asia, they needed a way to justify their exploitation of indigenous peoples and the transatlantic slave trade. That's when the idea of race as a hierarchy started to take root. They created a narrative that grouped people based on physical characteristics like skin color and assigned meaning to those differences. Europeans were placed at the top of this hierarchy, portrayed as civilized and superior, while people of African and indigenous descent were cast as inferior and uncivilized.
Yeah, that's right, Leia. And the racial hierarchy didn't just justify slavery, it was also baked into emerging systems of power and governance. For example, in colonial America, laws and policies were created to formalize this hierarchy. One example I could give is how early laws prevented enslaved black people from owning property or gaining education, ensuring that they stayed stuck at the bottom of society. And even though race isn't exactly biological, these ideas stuck. Over time, race became a way to define who could access wealth, land, and even basic human rights. Leia, what do you think were some of the long-term consequences of these early racial hierarchies?
Well, the consequences are enormous. These hierarchies became institutionalized, meaning they were built into systems like government, education, and the economy. This laid the foundation for what we now call systemic racism. For example, consider how land and ownership worked in colonial times. Only white men could own land, and that privilege was passed down through generations. Meanwhile, people of color were systemically excluded, which created a racial wealth gap that persists today.
Exactly, that was a great point to touch upon, Leia. I think that the racial wealth gap isn't just a historical issue, it's something that we're still grappling with today. Studies show that the average white family in the US has significantly more wealth than Black or Latino families, and that's not a coincidence. It's the direct result of these early racial hierarchies and policies like redlining, which denied people of color access to housing loans in the 20th century. But it's not just about economics, is it? These hierarchies also shaped how people were perceived and treated in everyday life.
Exactly. These racial hierarchies are not just theoretical, they were deeply embedded in everyday interactions, from the language people used to describe others to the ways people were treated in public spaces. These ideas influenced how individuals saw and treated one another. You saw this in everything from formal segregation laws to the informal social codes that dictated who can associate with who could use public facilities, and who had access to certain jobs.
Yeah, totally. And even today, the remnants of these racial constructs continue to affect how we interact with each other. These biases, even though they're subtle, are pervasive in everything from hiring practices to media representation, and they're still deeply ingrained in our societal norms. But of course, these systems didn't just remain static. They've evolved over time and have adapted to shifting social, political, and even economic contexts.
That's a great point. One major shift came with the civil rights movement of the 20th century. We saw legal changes like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that aimed to discriminate some of the institutional structures that upheld racial hierarchies. But the work didn't end there. While we saw progress in terms of laws, the underlying beliefs that fueled racism didn't appear overnight. That's why systemic racism continues to be such a persistent issue today.
So even though there were legal reforms, the deeper structures of inequality remain. This is why it's so important to understand how race and racism are woven into the very fabric of society. Now, we've mentioned a lot about systemic racism, but there's another crucial concept that we need to dive into, which is intersectionality. Leah, can you please explain how intersectionality frameworks help us understand the complexities of race and racism in a deeper way?
Absolutely. Intersectionality is a framework that helps us understand how different aspects of identity like race, class, gender, sexuality, and more intersect to shape our experiences of privilege and oppression. It acknowledges that people don't just experience race in isolation. For example, a black woman might experience racism and sexism in ways that are distinct from what a black man or a white woman would experience. This idea was first introduced by Kimberly Crenshaw, and it's incredibly powerful because it forces us to look at the overlap of identities and how systems of oppression are interwoven.
So basically what you're saying is that intersectionality gives us a way to understand how multiple forms of discrimination overlap and intensify each other, right? It's not just about looking at one identity or experience in isolation, it's about how those identities interact and compound.
Exactly, and that's why race is not just about skin color or physical features. It's also how those features intersect with other aspects of identity. It helps us understand why some people might face racial discrimination in a way that's very different from another person who might share their race but not their gender or class.
Man, it's fascinating to see how complex identity is. The truth is, these systems of oppression don't just affect one group, they affect entire communities in different ways. And that's why even when we talk about fighting racism, we have to think about all of these other intersections. It's not just enough to talk about race in isolation. We need to address how race, gender, and class, and all other identities shape people's lives.
Right, and by doing that, we can begin to better understand the full scope of racial injustice and work towards that lasting change. It's not just about fitting one part of the system, it's about tearing down the entire structure that perpetrates inequality.
Absolutely. And that brings us to our final point, which I want to touch on before we start to wrap things up, which is the idea of colorblindness. It's something that gets talked about a lot, but in the context of systemic racism, it's problematic, isn't it?
Yes, colorblindness is the idea that we should ignore race altogether and treat everyone the same. While this might sound like a good intention, it actually ignores the reality of racial inequality. By pretending race doesn't matter, you're also ignoring the historical and ongoing impacts of racism. It's like saying, I don't see race, but that leaves out the fact that society is deeply shaped by racial distinctions, and those distinctions have consequences.
Exactly. So instead of ignoring race, we should actively recognize it and understand how it shapes people's experiences. By acknowledging race and racism, we can begin to address these inequities head on.
Exactly, and that's the first step in creating a truly equal society.
Ha! Well said, Leia. I think we've covered a lot of ground today. From the origins of racial hierarchies to the importance of intersectionality and why colorblindness doesn't solve anything. It's a deep, complicated topic, but one that we all need to engage in if we're gonna make a meaningful change.
I agree. Thanks for having me on the show and for diving into such important issues.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Leia, and to all of our listeners, thank you for tuning in to Risky Reels Radio. We hope this conversation sparks some new thoughts and perspectives on the nature of race and racism in our society. Stay safe, stay thoughtful, and we'll catch you next time.
Special thanks to my GF, Leah for helping me make this podcast. Special thanks to my GF.